Well, you all know this small book, Naming and Necessity. For me, the best analytic book wrote in United States. And I wrote a book called How Do Proper Names Really Work in 23 by De Gruyter, Berlin, that it's not so original, but it's more more important for the present time because it revolutionizes the theory of reference. But there is a problem. First, I have autism. I'm unable to spread my views. Second, I live in northeast of Brazil, and and my proposals will not be evaluated by Oxford University Press or MIT Press. But I consider a kind of duty to make some effort to spread my views. Consequently, I will read the book or the main parts of the book here. And you can judge and look if you are interested, if you think there is some truth in my um, in what I'm saying. The there is a catch sentences in the beginning of the book. Probleme kann man nicht mit derselben Denkweise lösen, durch die sie entstanden sind. In English, problems cannot be solved by the same way of thinking through which they arose. From Albert Einstein. And so I come to the preface. Forward. My goal in this book is not to suggest new philosophical hunches about how proper names could work referentially, or even to take a strong stand on the multifarious present discussion. My goal is rather to develop what seems to me in its foundations to be an unexpectedly complex, comprehensive, and a definitive kind of two-tiered cluster theory of reference for proper names with wide-ranging consequences for other terms. My methodological assumptions are also diverse. They constitute a much more pragmatically than formally oriented philosophizing by examples. This is from Stroll, Wittgensteinian. This philosophizing by examples was to a large extent inspired by Wittgenstein's later comprehensive anti-scientific natural language therapeutic philosophy grounded on the idea of a surveyable representation, übersichtliche Darstellung, of the way language works. A critical procedure that must be that much of the present metaphysics of language does its best to forget. Along with it comes the multifaceted technique of using any available research to approach philosophical problems. So, another influence was the criticism against the fragmentation of present academic philosophy arising from scientism and premature specialization from Susan Hack. Instead, according to her, we should proceed by means of successive approximations, trying to reintegrate philosophical views on the basis of a principle of consilience, that is, the idea that reality, being unified, fosters inter-theoretical agreement. I believe that to a reasonable extent, this can also be the best strategy for the philosophical investigations of reference, which leads me to incorporate in my project ideas foreign to this subfield. For instance, Donald Williams' radically empiricist trope theory is here taken as a grounding ontological assumption. For such reasons, all that this book really demands from the reader is not as much proficiency as readiness for a new start. Readiness for a new start. This is very difficult to find. To make the understanding prima facie justifiable, some orienting historical remarks are in order concerning the investigation of the mechanisms of reference for proper names. There have been two distinct periods in the philosophy of linguistic analysis. Well, what follows is historical, and I will skip. I'll not read the whole thing. I'll continue with the introduction. To help the reader, who I assume to be a non-specialist, I begin by offering short summaries of the main ideas of each chapter. Chapters 1 and 2 are preparatory, critically and constructively examining the most central ideas of the old and new orthodoxies on proper names, some of which seem to be almost forgotten. Chapters 3, 4, and 5 are dedicated to exposition and defense of my own theory. Chapter 6 is concerned with what this theory might change if applied to other singular and general terms, indexicals for example. Chapter 1 is dedicated to an exposition and evaluation of the merits and limits of traditional descriptivist views of proper names, which were mainly developed by Frege, Russell, Wittgenstein, Strawson, and John Searle. According to these views, proper names are essentially abbreviations of definite descriptions, or clusters of definite descriptions. A proper name refers to its bearer if it sufficiently satisfies the cluster. It is important to consider the history of descriptivism in order to counter its simplified, distorted, and caricatured interpretations by the new orthodoxy. Saul Kripke and his closest followers, David and Sterling, have assumed the existence of two types of description theories, classical and modern. According to the classical theory, defended by Frege and Russell, a proper name is the abbreviation of a single definite description. For instance, Bismarck is the abbreviation of a definite description, like the first Chancellor of the German Empire. Since many definite descriptions can be associated with a proper name, and since there is no obvious criterion to choose the relevant ones, the old theory was replaced by modern theories defended mainly by Wittgenstein, Strauss, and Searle. According to these modern theories, called cluster descriptivism, a proper name abbreviates a set of definite descriptions, which are either all the descriptions that can be associated with a proper name, or at least the weightiest ones. The interpretative thesis I defend in the first chapter is that the distinction between classical and modern descriptivism is highly deceptive, a typical case of a distinction without difference. All the mentioned philosophers, even if not explicitly, as in the case of Frege and Russell, were already cluster descriptivists. The main difference was aspectual. Beginning with Frege, descriptivist philosophers have approached the same problem from different perspectives and with different interests and assumptions, and their views can be shown to be profitably complementary. It is easy to understand, for instance, that Searle's theory has been developed in much more detail than Frege's occasional remarks, since the former theory was the last to appear. The first to appear. The last to appear. Searle's theory, in its turn, replaces Strauss's more restricted idea of reference borrowing with a wider idea of parasitic reference. In the present book, proposals of the descriptivist philosophers will be gradually developed and integrated into a single more complex theory, which is why it is advantageous to explain and discuss them in the first chapter. Particularly important in the first chapter is the addendum. There I suggest that weightier descriptions associated with proper names could be seen as patterns derived from their identification rules, an idea inspired by Michael Dummett's Wittgensteinian interpretation of Frege, and also by Ernst Tugendhat's classical analysis of the singular predicative statement. According to Tugendhat, the proper name must have an identification rule, Identifikationsregel, which can be satisfied by criteria belonging to its bearer when the proper name is not empty. My proposal is that the cluster of descriptions suggested by cluster theorists should be intrinsically associated with the linguistic expression of the proper name's identification rule, a modest insight that turns out to present analytically surprising difficulties and consequently will be developed only in the third chapter. Chapter 2 is a critical exposition of the more recent causal historical views first suggested by, if you find you know all of these more or less, you can skip to the first chapter. This is for people who does not know the problematic. Chapter 2 is a critical exposition of the more recent causal historical view first suggested by Saul Kripke and Kate Donnellan in the early 70s. See how late we are and without developments. This view was and remains decisive for developing the so-called New Orthodoxy, which has largely replaced the old orthodoxy since then. The chapter begins with a general presentation of the causal historical criticism of descriptivist theories, followed by descriptivist answers. I'm not the first to show that the objections against descriptivism advanced by Kripke, Kate Donnellan, and others, although having their good points, are far from decisive. You can see Searle, 1983, chapter 9, or Ahmed in 2007, chapter 2, and so on and so on. But they don't take account of these answers, because people who work with this, they are very good trained in logic, and they prefer to be Kripkean than Searlean or neo-descriptivists. It is easier. I'm sorry to say this, but we go further. The main theme of the second chapter, however, is the place of the causal historical chain in the attempt to explain the proper name's reference. According to Kripke, a proper name refers because it is used at the end of a causal historical chain that typically begins with a baptismal ceremony of the referred object, reference, performed by some speaker to an audience. My goal is to show that, although obvious that there must be external, physical, causal, or causal historical chains that usually begin by associating a baptizer with the speech of the naming and attempt to identify the links of these causal chains with, at some point, inevitably resort to intentions, committing us to open or hidden forms of cognitive awareness of the reference. There must be, together with the chain, the intention to refer to the same, as Kripke says. This cognitive awareness can easily be translated into the form of descriptions, which commits causal referentialism to some sort of covert descriptivism. In other words, the causal historical view is unavoidably trapped in a petitio principii. Although its goal is to overcome descriptivism, it must presuppose it in some way to gain any explanatory power. Even if descriptivism without causalism is empty, which I admit, causalism without descriptivism would be entirely blind, since reference at some point entails awareness of it. Some form of descriptivism must be assumed. That is, if you have intention, the intention can always be described, can always be transformed in some kind of description. And since Kripke allows that, in beginning the causal chain, you need to have the intention, and the people who hear need to have the same intention. Well, description is implicit. Beyond this, one needs to realize that it's not only the causal historical chain initiated by baptism that can give rise to the speech act of naming, which in a good measure relativizes Kripke's original idea. Any causal historical chain initiated by occurrences related to the existence of the names bearer can give rise to relevant descriptions. And these descriptions can have referential import, some of them in this respect even more important than baptism, which Kripke restrictively sees as if it were the only relevant origin of a causal historical chain. For instance, the causal historical chain initiated by the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand by Gravillo Principe, which produced the corresponding definite description, seems to have a considerable referential import when we utter the proper name Gravillo Principe. It's not from the beginning assured that the causal chain initiated by the baptism of Gravillo is more important for the referential function of this name than the causal chain initiated by the assassination of the Archduke. This is viewed as the event that triggered the First World War, which is why we still remember an otherwise obscure Serbian nationalist. Only in chapters 3, 4, and 5 do I develop my own more refined form of neo-descriptivist cluster theory. This theory can be seen as a meta-descriptivist, since it is a two-typed theory oriented by meta-descriptive rules that are able to select and evaluate the weightiest descriptions belonging to the cluster of descriptions attached to a proper name in order to evaluate its referential success. Well, I didn't promise it a very easy thing. Chapter 3 is the central one, and it is not easy to summarize. The methodological leitfaden to find the weightiest descriptions is taken from Austin, who advised us to consult lexicons as a pre-philosophical work. Since proper names are seldom found in lexicons, I began by checking what encyclopedia entries had to say about famous proper names. What I found was that if we do this, we can clearly identify two complex kinds of descriptions that almost always appear prominently, and because of this can be justly called the fundamental ones. One, localizing descriptions, telling the time, place, and career of the proper name's bearer. And two, characterizing descriptions, telling the decisive reasons why we use that proper name to refer to its bearer. A key part of my view is the assumption that, at least for privileged users of proper names, those who know how to apply them in the most complete way. These two kinds of descriptions belonging to the cluster are the irreplaceably weightiest. Having found these two most fundamental kinds of descriptions, the next task was to find a meta rule requiring the combination and measures of satisfaction of such descriptions that allow the application of proper names. My argument shows that what this meta rule, the meta-descriptivist rule, most often demands regarding proper names is that at least a disjunction of localizing and characterizing descriptions must be sufficiently satisfied by the referent in the absence of any equally weighted competitor. Moreover, we have implicit knowledge of the metadescriptive rule and its variations. The application of the metadescriptive rule to the cluster of descriptions we associated with a particular proper name forms what we can rightly call its identification rule, Identifikationsregel for Tugendhat. A rule whose existence was already speculatively suggested by Ernst Tugendhat in 1983 and earlier. This allows us, for instance, to confidently refer to Sir Isaac Newton insofar as we know that he was a man who lived in England from 1642 to 1727, who too, as a great physicist, discovered classical mechanics, the law of universal gravitation, and the infinitesimal calculus, satisfying these conditions as a whole more than any other person. This is in a capsule, the rule. But we need to prove how this works, to show how this really works in order to warrant it. The above summarized usual mechanism is restricted to privileged users, specialists, baptizers, familiars. It excludes the too often second-hand referential use of proper names by non-privileged users, the majority. That is, by the many people who are able to associate with a proper name only some less relevant description or even some wrong but rightly classified description. The possession of these descriptions already enables a person to insert the proper name in public discourse by means of a parasitical form of reference. Furthermore, the fundamental difference between the rigidity of proper names and the accidentality of definite descriptions pointed out by Kripke can now be explained from a neo-descriptivist perspective. Defining a possible world as a total way the world is or might have been, we can say the following. A proper name is rigid because it can identify its bearer in all possible worlds where this referent can be said to exist. which is accomplished by applying variable sets of descriptions belonging to its fundamental cluster of descriptions in sufficient degrees and without competitors, as prescribed by the meta rule. An isolated definite description, however, is accidental because it can be said to change its reference in different possible worlds, insofar as its application does not need to coincide with the application of the in each world differently selected descriptions belonging to the cluster of the associated proper name. This is the reason why those rare definite descriptions that do not belong to any cluster of descriptions distinctive for a proper name can be said to be rigid. They cannot but apply in any possible world where the bearer exists. Example: the rafflesia discovered by Dr. Joseph Arnold on May 20, 1818. It would be contradictory to attempt to conceive a possible world where this same event occurred and its description does not apply. So it is the link between the description and the proper name that makes the description flaccid and the proper name rigid. But if there is no link and we have only the description turns to be rigid. The explanation is completely different from the explanation given by Kripke, and it is the right, obviously right explanation if you study the theory. Chapter 4 addresses the main classical objections against descriptivism. Appealing to the theoretical developments already presented in the previous chapter, in this chapter I give detailed answers to the classical counterexamples offered by Kripke, like those of Schmidt's case and the semi-fictional prophet Jonah, and from Donnellan's, like those of Thales, Tom's friendly guest, and so on. The answers are, in my judgment, very conclusive, and I regard their success as a decisive measure of the proposed theory's superiority. An important point in answering Donnellan's counterexample of Thales was to show that causal historical chains leave behind what we can call causal records, which are cognitively retained, publicly recognized events that can on their side be converted into descriptions, some of them belonging to fundamental descriptions. Thus, the fact that Aristotle quoted Thales' affirmation that water is the principle of everything is a causal trace fixed in his writings and later publicly retained, a trace that belongs to the causal record and that reappears in the cluster's definite description, the philosopher quoted by Aristotle as having said that the principle of everything is water. This finding plays a decisive role in refuting Donnellan's simplified claim that Thales would still be Thales even if he did not satisfy the definite description of having said that all things are water, because he was the causal origin of our spelling of this name. No, we refer to Thales mostly because, simplifying things, he is the bearer of the definite description the philosopher quoted by Aristotle as having said that the principle of everything is water, not the philosopher who said that everything is water. This remains true even if the content of Aristotle's quotation was mistaken. Chapter 5 deals with sentences that state identities between proper names. Here, the meta-descriptive theory is applied in favor of a neo-Fregean solution for what could be called Frege's identity indifference puzzle, the identity indifference puzzle, regarding the informativeness of identity statements of the kind A is equal B, where A and B are proper names, which is meant to enhance this view. This is made partly against Kripke's interpretation of such identity statements as necessary, since for Frege, empirical statements of the kind A equals B would be a posteriori and contingent. The result is a combination with which we can derive a necessary a priori statement of referential identity from the more explicit contingent a priori statement of the difference between the senses. Kripke's necessary a posteriori results here from the confusion of they result here from the confusion of the necessity of identity with the contingency of the difference. Chapter 6 is an unsystematic collection of provisional sketches. Its goal is to show some of the many relevant consequences of the proposed meta-descriptive theory of proper names for all the main terms of our language, like indexicals and general terms, with the main result of showing that the apparently convincing externalist thought experiences of Hilary Putnam and others are defeasible. A conclusive application of the suggested neo-descriptivist approach to all kinds of terms, along with the implications, would require an entire new book. Finally, I wish to sketch some vague metaphilosophical views guiding the present investigation that deserve to be stressed in order to prevent misunderstanding. A question that could be posed concerns the 50 years conflict between descriptivism, internalism, and referentialism, externalism. A common impression, mine at least, is that we remain stalemated because nothing sufficiently plausible and philosophically groundbreaking as a theory of reference has arisen to overcome the old conflict. As of course this book. I can give a few examples that reinforce this impression. One, although it has a point which I believe I have to some extent rescued in this book, two-dimensionalism based on contentious logical semantic principles has diversified itself into an inextricable variety of competing views, which seems to typify it as a regressive research program. And two, alternative theories like predicativism are deviants. We can for sure distinguish that Mary, pointing to a teenager over there, from this Mary pointed to an older woman here. But by uttering the sentence, that Mary is not this Mary. In the case, we are using proper nouns predicatively, and this can be of interest to linguistics. But when we use the name Aristotle in a course of Greek philosophy, assuming it is distinct from the name Aristotle said in a yacht belonging to the Aristotle Onassis family, we are not using the name in a predicative sense. We are intending to refer to an individual. Moreover, in the most proper sense of the term proper name, what we are investigating in this book, which can formally be expressed by an individual constant referring to a particular, we are considering the function of a singular term in contradistinction to the function of general terms. This is not only logically but also epistemically and ontologically of greater interest. 3. Referentialism, like Putnam, Kaplan, Salmon, Solms, defending the intuitively implausible idea that meaning belongs to the realm of reference, remained for many unable to explain empty terms and modes of presentation convincingly. The metaphor of mental files, repositories of information of Perry, Recanati, and so on, associated with proper names, is a way of explaining differences in cognitive values, replacing Frege's concept of modes of presentation seen without disposing of externalism. Is an attempt. So, the files for Cicero and Tully in the statement Cicero is Tully, though having the same informational content, say Roman orator, can only be numerically distinct, and even though able to explain why these names have different cognitive values. So, Recanati. Nevertheless, a cognitive value still seems to demand more than a numerical distinction. Two tokens of Tully are numerically distinct, nevertheless maintaining the same expected cognitive value. Moreover, phylers must be understood as cognitions containing non-conceptual information, which sounds inconsistent insofar as concepts do not need to be linguistically constructed. It's clear to me that the views developed in the present book can enable us to solve the problems differently addressed by the above considered alternatives with greater clarity, economy, and explanatory power, simply by extricating us from the methodological and conceptual conflicts that produced the stalemate between the old and new orthodoxy. Final advisement. We live in a world dominated by science. Because of this, it makes sense to think that much of the philosophy of language today, due to the ways philosophy is academically practiced, whose incentives and evaluation often simulate those of science, too easily lead us to scientism, and from scientism to what Susan Hack called precocious specialization. What she means is that a number of merely hypothetical philosophical ideas are treated as if they were well-grounded scientific principles, upon which edifices of discussion should be built. The result is that she calls is what she calls a fragmentation of philosophy, since the questionable foundations of these edifices must be dogmatically accepted by their practitioners. The result of is a forced separation among these artificially trusted buildings, creating a segmented philosophical practice. In this atmosphere, broad syntheses, rightly rejecting these foundations, are consequently treated as if their possibilities should right at the start be excluded from the discussion. As a result, theorists can be fated to end up discussing, as she writes, how many philosophers could dance on the head of a pin. If you take another look at the different approaches to proper names indicated in the last paragraph, you'll get a sense of what she means. Hack grounds the antidote for the foregone state of affairs on accepting a principle of consilience, the idea that since reality is unified, different sources can converge on strong conclusions. This comes from Wilson. A good example among many others is Darwin's theory of evolution, which was later reinforced by Mendelian and molecular genetics. In philosophy, a similar convergence could only be obtained through sufficiently comprehensive and eventually progressive investigation. Much earlier, Wittgenstein sought in a similar vein to justify his rejection of logical positivism. As he dictated in his blue book, philosophers constantly see the method of science before their eyes and are irresistibly tempted to ask and answer questions in the way science does. This tendency is the real source of metaphysics and leads the philosopher into complete darkness. Instead of answering questions in the way science does, according to Wittgenstein, we should instead look for surveyable representations, übersichtliche Darstellungen, of the pragmatic rules of our natural language, even if at the cost of vagueness and lack of details. As he wrote, the main source of our failure to understand is that we do not have an overview of the use of our words. Our grammar is lacking in surveyability. A surveyable representation produces just that understanding which consists in sane connections, hence the importance of finding and inventing intermediate links. Although developed in a definite and systematic way, the broad theoretical approach proposed and developed in the present books has similar goals. It might even be true that fragmented philosophy can be motivating for researchers working in related scientific fields. Nonetheless, it can represent a bad import for philosophers interested in achieving reasonable forms of theoretical comprehensiveness in the pursuit of truth. After all, this has been an appropriate goal through the whole history of philosophy. Well, this introduction is somewhat tedious because it does not come to the real thing. I will continue with chapter 1, the true history of descriptivism, not the history that is usually told